episode of the Dram Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, very much appreciated. And yeah, I thought it was an interesting episode. I thoroughly enjoyed doing it. It's always nice to do something a little bit different, where I didn't choose the lineup. So yeah, that was pretty cool. And like I said, you know, if you have whiskies you want me to review, feel free to send me samples. Anyway, so this week we're kind of going back to the normal. I've chosen what we're going to be looking at, but before we do that, I just thought I'd mention this month's the current whisky magazine, and I've not been obviously paid to promote the magazine, but I thought what was interesting is there were some really interesting articles about sustainability in the magazine. I mean, it's nice to see some sort of, you know, more in-depth topics tackled than sort of which whiskey bars or cocktail bars in Japan to go and visit. But there was one interesting article there about peat and how peat bogs have basically been mismanaged, or that's what the implication of the article was about. Now, I honestly thought that the peat bogs, being a natural resource, would be managed quite carefully by whoever owned the peat bogs, but it seems that's probably not the case. Although the article did state that the majority of peat excavation is obviously for horticulture, and only 4% of peat extracted per year actually is used by the whisky industries. But they were saying that obviously, as we well know, that sort of the peat bogs kind of soak up carbon dioxide, and if they're not managed, they dry out, they become useless. And, you know, like I said, I thought that being a natural product and very highly used by the industry, that they would manage these so that, you know, that the peat bogs wouldn't dry out. That obviously, I mean, yes, peat obviously takes, you know, considerable length of time to sort of to build up. Although again, the article implied that as soon as you basically sort of get the peat bog wet again, it kind of like starts up production. So, but to be fair, it did basically say that, you know, a number of the large distillery owners, such as Diageo, are now investing money in the preservation and sort of recreation of peat bogs. And really, when you think about it, so they should. I mean, the whisky industry has made millions and millions of pounds from this natural resource. It's probably, like I say, it's about time that, you know, they gave something back, you know, and at the end of the day, if they don't, then peat is going to be banned from being used. I mean, certainly the article stated that peat extraction for horticulture is going to be banned from or up around about 2024, I think. And, you know, obviously that would stop, you know, the lion's share of peat being extracted. But, you know, it's still a possibility that the government may well put restrictions on the amount of peat that can be extracted. And, well, that is going to basically make your peated malt damn sight more expensive if there's not, you know, the raw materials, and the raw materials are going to go up in price, and it may well force some distilleries that rely on peat to stop using it, which basically means the character of your whisky is going to change. Plus, of course, if certain peat bogs are decommissioned, which they are on occasion, you know, you may well find that the actual peated character of your spirit is going to change, you know, which, you know, may well upset an awful lot of people. So anyway, let's hope that, you know, that the whisky industry, you know, does get its kind of house in order with regards to sort of peat extraction, and the government isn't too draconian. Well, let's hope, shall we say. But yeah, like I say, pick up a copy of this month's or this quarter's whisky magazine, because there are some really intriguing articles about other things, you know, to do with sustainability and carbon neutrality and all that kind of stuff, which is, you know, climate change, the buzzword of today at the moment, isn't it? So so yeah. But anyway, that I just thought that was intriguing. It's got absolutely nothing at all to do with this week's episode of the show whatsoever. So let's talk about what we're doing today. So, as you can see from the title page, we're looking at some new releases, or relatively new releases, from both Stauning in Denmark and Starward in Australia. And you're thinking, why is he tasting them together? What's the connection? Well, there is actually two connections, and they're not obvious, otherwise you'd probably go, oh, I know. The first is that they're both distributed by the same company, which is called Cask Liquid Marketing. So firstly, a big thank you to Cask Liquid Marketing for the samples for today's episode of the show, and I hope you enjoy the reviews. The second one is less obvious. If the first one wasn't obvious, probably wasn't. But both of these distilleries, in my personal opinion, have made huge steps in the balance and the quality of what they're bringing to the market. Now, initially, my early tastings of Stauning were that, like a lot of European distilleries, they were releasing their stuff far too early. It was too young, it was too fainty, it just hadn't spent enough time in the oak to remove a lot of the impurities, and it wasn't cheap, and you know, it's kind of another one of those kind of like, well, do I want to shell out a load of money for something interesting or a work in progress? And to a certain extent, the same could be said for Starward, although Starward were basically far too interested in oak. I mean, they still are. I mean, and it was kind of like, you know, Ampera casks, you know, Australian cherry casks, red wine casks, and that's pretty much all you could taste. The balance was so skewed towards the cask that you couldn't tell what the character of the spirit was like. Now, as you probably well know, I think last year I did an episode on Starward, and I think I did an episode on Stauning earlier this year, and praised both of the distilleries for now having some kind of balance in there. I think Stauning maybe use a little bit more active oak. They still have a tendency to release fairly young, so you know, you are going to get that youthful character, but there seems to be sort of a better balance. And the same could be said for Starward. And I think with Starward, I think the reason why the balance is better with Starward is that obviously when the distillery was first in production and they were using the wine casks, that was it. First fill wine casks. Now obviously we're a number of years down the line of their production, and I think what they're doing with their bottlings is, yes, they're still using a lot of wine casks, but they're probably using a lot less first fill wine casks. They're using more refilled wine casks. So again, like I said, the balance from what I have previously tasted was considerably better. So I thought, good fun to look at some new releases, and well, let's just introduce them, shall we? Right, okay, so we're going to look at the Stauning bottlings first, then we'll go on to the three Starward ones, and we're going to kick off with one that I really like. I mean, I love the name, Stauning Bastard. It means I can basically say a naughty word on YouTube, and if they complain I can say, well, it's the product's name, I'm not swearing, honest governor. So, why have they called it Bastard? I mean, brilliant, I think. Well, basically, it is their floor malted rye, which spends 3 years in virgin American oak, and then it's spent 6 months in ex-mezcal casks from Oro de Oaxaca, and brilliant. I mean, you know, there's not an awful lot of mezcal cask finished whiskey knocking about. You may well remember I did an episode of the show on Dewars, and they had an 8-year-old that was finished in ex-mezcal cask, which was really intriguing. So I'm hoping for good things from this one, and it's bottled at 46.3%, not 63, sorry. Second bottling of Stauning we'll be looking at is they've called El Clasico, rather than calling it a rude word. So this is bottled at 45.7% and wholly aged in ex-vermouth casks. Different, interesting. When I saw that they were on the list, I basically sort of said, well, I've got to try those, you know. So yeah, that could well be interesting. Then we're going to look at the three new Stauning, or about three new Starward bottlings, or relatively new bottlings. The first one we're looking at is what they've called Left Field. It's a single malt. and it's aged in ex-Australian wine casks, as is their norm. I think that has replaced one of the earlier bottlings, and I think it was at Nova, I think, possibly, I forget. So yeah, not really a great deal else to say apart from their single malt, aged in ex-Australian wine cask, bottled at 46%. Obviously no chill filtration and no colouring, which is what we like to see. Second bottling is called Dolce. Now this again, single malt, aged in initially in ex-Australian red wine casks, as we well know, and then finished in an Australian interpretation of a Sicilian dessert wine. Could be interesting. This is actually, doesn't carry an age statement, but this is probably I think the first bottling that I've come across that gives an indication of age. So it was distilled in 2016, bottled in 2020, so 4 years old. So at least we have a kind of an idea of the age of the spirit that they're bottling. And then the last bottling we'll be looking at, they've called Fortis, again single malt, and this has basically been aged in ex-American oak casks that have been seasoned with red wines. So I wonder what difference that's going to make to the left field. So yeah, some interesting stuff. It's a shame that the bottling that I really loved of theirs, which was called the name has just completely eluded me, but it was the bottling that was a blend of malt and wheat, twofold, that's it. It seems to have been discontinued, which is a real shame, because that was, I think, the bottling that I tasted that really convinced me that Starward had indeed changed quite considerably. You know, you got the character of the barley, you got the character of the wheat, and the oak was supporting. So, like I said, I'm expecting really good things from these bottlings. So let's find out then, shall we? Right, okay, so let's kick off with the bastard then, shall we? Or kick the bastard out, or whatever. I just love to sort of, like, you know, say bastard and then have Motorhead's Bastard play in the background, but of course obviously I can't do that because it would be copyright infringing. But anyway, let's see what this bastard gives us then, shall we? Alright, that's the last time I used the bastard word. Oh, sorry. Anyway, let's see what the nose is like. Right, the mezcal is very obvious when you kick off with. It's got that obvious smoky pulped fruit kind of character, but the rye has got that lovely youthful intensity, and it's sort of really pushing through, and it's got that lovely dark spicy dark rye bread kind of character. A little bit of cinnamon, pepper, touch of sweeter rye notes as well, touch of toasty American oak in the background. Certainly the virgin oak is kind of there, but like I said, it's not sort of like, you know, in your face. And you know what? When it kind of all settles down, it's actually really very, very good. Yes, all right, the mezcal is very noticeable up front because it has a very distinctive character, you know, and you sort of like, you know, it's, I wouldn't say it's unexpected. You obviously know it's going to happen. It's there. You know what the spirit has been aged in. And it's just that you pick, or I certainly pick up on that characteristic straight off the bat, you know. But I think once you kind of almost ignore that kind of note, you realise that there's actually a lot more going on here than meets the eye. And I think that's a superb. I love this. This is great, you know. Great bastard, as they say. Oops. Let's see what the tastes like. That's an interesting palate. I mean, it's kind of bookended by the mezcal cask. It kicks off with that smoky pulped white fruit and finishes with it, which is really interesting. And in between, you get that sort of sweet and spicy rye, dark spices, a little bit of toasty oak, nippy, lovely nippy sort of rye spices, bottled just at the right ABV. I think any sort of higher, I think it may well sort of just push those spices a little further to the fore, and just sort of, I wouldn't say compromise the balance, but I just think that's absolutely spot on. It's got great great depth to it. It's got a lovely progression, like I said, starting off with the mezcal cask and ending with the mezcal cask notes, and in between you get the sort of like the American oak and the rye. What more do you want? That is really very, very good. Right, okay, so let's move on to the vermouth cask, so bottled at 45.7%. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? I get sweet and sour kind of vermouth notes. There's some cinnamon, musky spice. It's got that kind of potpourri kind of character as well. Yeah, quite peppery as well. I don't really get any rye spice whatsoever. No rye, nothing else at all. Again, this for me is kind of just too heavy on the why didn't they use it as a finish? I mean, you know, the Bastard worked really amazingly well because the finishing cask didn't overpower everything else, whereas in this case all I can smell is vermouth, and you know, it's kind of, it's just not particularly that interesting. I mean, the quality of the casks obviously that they've used are very good. There's no off notes, there's no blemishes, but nothing other than the cask. Anyway, let's see if the palate's any different. A bit of sticky sweet finish. I'm not the world's biggest fan of vermouth, it has to be said. I'll give it credit that on the palate there is a little bit more balance. I can certainly taste a little bit of very youthful rye spirit, but not really a great deal of anything else. It's a bit sweet. Maybe if this had been bottled at a higher ABV, I don't know why they chose 45.7. It does seem like a little bit of an odd ABV to pick, but well, maybe that's what they wanted. Maybe they wanted that little sort of syrupy sweetness on the finish. I don't know. For me, I'm nowhere near as enamoured by it as I am the Bastard. El Clasico, yeah, not sure about that. Okay, let's jump into some red wine matured spirit then. Let's see what left field gives us then, shall we? Okay, well, it is carrying on the current tradition of the Starward distillery. It's got a lovely balance to it. I'm getting the distillery character. It's got that slightly estery, sort of slightly bubblegummy, white fruit, apricot, barley, citrus, bit of ginger, and in the background the red fruit is there. There's a sort of slight spiciness, some vanilla, a little bit of black pepper, a little bit of black fruit. Yeah, I mean, that's a lovely nose, it has to be said. Again, like I say, it's balanced. The wine cask is not sort of like overwhelming the character of the spirit, and that spirit character just ticks all the boxes for me. And at the end of the day, I know I keep banging on and on and on about balance, but that's what I want to drink. You know, that I don't want something that sort of tastes of one thing or another, and you know, like the El Clasico, which all I can taste is, you know, the vermouth. This has, it's not alright. Okay, I'm going to argue it's not the most complex. It's still relatively young, but you know, what it delivers is pleasant. And you know, some spirits, some whiskies, you know, although may lack, you know, you bottle them early, they may lack a little bit in complexity, but sometimes they make up for it in that youthful exuberance. And certainly I think this, you could argue that this definitely does that. So pass on. Well, like the nose, it kind of kicks off with the sort of the estery fruit, the barley, the excuse me. Oh, I think that's El Clasico having its revenge. The wine notes do come in fairly quickly, I'll give it that. Sweet red fruit, a little bit of syrup, some pepper, and that kind of like does kind of linger. There's a little bit of vanilla. I think I kind of prefer the nose to the palate. The palate is still, I think, relatively well balanced. Again, a bit simple. A little on the short side. There's maybe a little bit of a mentholy note just coming through right on the aftertaste. Yeah, I think it's pleasant. I think it's a good whiskey. I would love to see this, you know, with a little bit more age under its belt. I think that would be an intriguing thing to see, to how this evolves. You know, will the wine cask slowly become more dominant? Will the estery youthful fruit sort of drop off? Who knows? I mean, but you know, it would be an interesting thing to see. But coming back to this particular bottling, yes, I think it's pleasant. I think personally I preferred the Nova bottling to this particular one, but I don't think it's a bad bottling at all. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Dolce. So bottled at 48%. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Oh, that's a winey monster. Sweet raspberry, strawberry, plenty of late harvested darkish kind of honeyed fruit, chunky, malty, dried fruits, a little bit of spice, touch of brown sugar. I'm not really getting any real distillery character coming through here. It kind of, you can kind of sense spirit, if you see what I mean, rather than the actual character. I mean, alright, yeah, maybe there's a little bit of esteriness there just at the edge, but the oak is really, really dominant, and it's quite a sweet nose as well. Although, you know, I think the alcohol is just about balancing. I think if this had been bottled at 46, I think you would have probably had a much sweeter nose. But you know, you're going to have to, have a bit of a sweet tooth for this one, I think. Anyway. Let's see what the palate like. That's sweet. It kicks off with a lot of sweet fruit, sort of raspberries, strawberry, touch of vanilla, honey, obvious kind of sort of fortified, winey, sort of honeyed, kind of late harvested honeyed kind of character going on. Bitters quite a lot on the mid palate, and that kind of lingers right to the finish. You can argue that, I suppose, that bitterness is certainly offsetting the sweetness, so in that respect the bitter-sweet balance is pretty good. But again, I'm not really getting a great deal of distillery character. We're all oak again. We're kind of like, you know, almost back to how Starward used to be. And it's really not really floating my boat like the left field, it has to be said. Yeah, it's interesting, but you know, I think the balance is obviously, you know, pretty heavily skewed towards the oak in this respect. So so yeah, let's move on then. Right, okay, so moving on to the Fortis. So this is bottled at 50%. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Yeah, it's not quite as sweet as, say, the left field. Probably more complex as well. There's more barley, there's some citrus, there's probably a little less estery fruit, but it's certainly there. The oak is really spicy. Definite sort of American oak character, slightly grippy tannins, sweet red fruits, a little bit of syrup again, touch of wood smoke. Again, this is just really well balanced. I'm certainly getting, yeah, I'm getting the distillery character. I'm getting the American oak character. I'm getting the wine character. It's just, it's a lovely nose at the end of the day. It's really well balanced. And it, you know, it just goes to show that, you know, when you get the balance right, you get a level of complexity. And that's like I said, that's what I keep going on about, and that's what I want from a whiskey. See what it smells like. Kicks off with more of the red wine cask, so red fruit, bit of chocolate, a little bit of a bit of tannin going on. Spirit character does come through a little bit on the mid palate, a little bit of apricot, quince, and then we're moving back into the oak, which becomes quite toasty on the finish. Yeah, I mean, again, alright, palate is a little bit more heavy on the oak, but again, I think it has a good progression. It kicks off with the wine cask. I get a bit of distillery character sort of in the middle, and then we kind of come back to the slightly more sort of American toasty oak on the finish. There's a little bit of butteriness, a little bit of vanilla, but overall I think the length is pretty good. I can't remember what this is retailing for. 60 odd quid, something like that, I think. Might not be as high as that, you'd have to check it out. But either way, I really like that. I mean, it's got a lot of personality, it's got balance, it's got progression, and yeah, I think that's pretty damn good. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. Well, as I said earlier, a big thank you to Cask Liquid Marketing for the samples for today's episode of the show. Hopefully they won't be too disappointed with the review, and yeah, likewise the two distilleries involved. I think sort of, you know, again, some hits, some misses. I think overall the quality of what both distilleries are producing is very, very good, and it's a case of, you know, you pick your poison at the end of the day. I mean, for me, the Bastard was an absolute bastard, but, you know, in a good way. I mean, I loved that. I thought that really was good. Yes, you could argue that the whole mezcal cask thing is a little bit kind of what's the word, sort of yeah, in vogue, I suppose. It's a little bit sort of, but, you know, again, worked really nicely. I mean, I love mezcal, as you well know, and I just thought that the balance worked really well on that. Whereas the El Clasico didn't do it for me at all. It was kind of far too oaky. All I got really was the sort of vermouth, and it just, you know, well, you know, if I want to taste vermouth, I'll buy a bottle of vermouth at the end of the day, which is pretty unlikely, to be honest with you, but there you go. So, you know, 1-1 for Stauning, as they say, and yeah, like I say, I thought Bastard was pretty damn good. I'll just say Bastard again. Anyway, moving on to the 3 bottlings from Starward. I thought the left field was pretty good. Yeah, okay, you could argue it's a touch on the simplistic side. But, you know, I thought it had plenty of charm. Yeah, okay, the palate was maybe not quite up to what the nose was suggesting it was going to be like. But, again, I thought, you know, the balance was pretty good at the end of the day. And I don't think it's that expensive. I forget now, to be honest with you. The Dolce was, again, a bit disappointing. It kind of harked back to Starward of old. Overly oak influenced, no distillery character, and I suppose, you know, it's pretty much not a surprise. You know, aged in ex-red wine casks, and then you shove it into ex-dessert wine casks. You know, it's kind of, well, yeah, you're really going to expect any distillery character to survive that? I think you'd be pushed to find any distillery that would survive that. I mean, I was tasting, what was it I was tasting the other day? A bottling of Glentorquers, I think it was. I think it had been sort of aged in refill sherry butts and then finished in first fill sherry butt. And it's kind of like, well, you know, even Glentorquist, which does have a tendency to be pretty good at handling, you know, sherry, I wasn't going to bloody well survive that, you know. And I can't remember how old it was now, 14, 16, something like that, you know. It was kind of like, not hoping hell. And it didn't, you know. It was kind of like, well, anyway, it may well end up in a tasting episode in due course, you never know. And the final bottling, the Fortis. Yeah, like I said, I thought that was really very, very good. I was kind of slightly apprehensive, you know, sort of American oak, seasoned American oak, you know, could have been sort of like, you know, again, an overtly oak monster, but no, balanced really nicely again. So like I said, it seems to imply to me that the distillery in certain bottlings is using, you know, a judicious amount of first fill wine casks and you know, a good chunk of refill wine casks, just to basically keep the wine balanced. And you know, that I think is the kind of like the key word for today's episode of the show, apart from bastard. Yeah, so there you go. That's this week's episode of the show in the bag. I hope you've enjoyed it. You know, if any of these do sound like your kind of thing and they're available in your market, certainly I would suggest giving them a try, because you know, they are really, really intriguing at the end of the day. So anyway, slightly quicker episode than often is the case. So all that's left to say is good afternoon and get some bastard in you.